You're addicted. Not to social media, not to YouTube. You're addicted to being weak. Every swipe, every scroll, every just 5 more minutes is your brain begging you to stay small, lazy, powerless, and you obey, like a damn puppet. Look at yourself. Hours wasted staring at faces that don't care about you. Every dopamine hit, a punch to your ambition. Pixel by pixel, your potential dies while you scroll. You tell yourself it's harmless. Lies. Every second wasted is a second stolen from your life. You're disappearing and you don't even notice. You scroll thinking you're in control. You're not. Your ego? Crushed. Your dreams? Mocked silently while someone else lives the life you refuse to chase. Deep down, you know it. Yet here you are, thumb moving, eyes glued, still weak, still addicted. Every notification, every trending video, every endless feed, it's designed to keep you hooked. And it works because you let it. You think you're having fun. You think you're resting. No, you're dying slowly, watching time slip past, waiting for a life that's never coming because you keep feeding distraction instead of ambition. Stoicism can fix this. Not tomorrow, not someday, right now. Here's how. Step 1. Notice the craving. The next time your thumb reaches for your phone, stop, breathe, watch the urge, feel it, don't obey it. That discomfort? That's growth, that's freedom knock. Most people panic and scroll anyway. Not you. You stare it down. You learn to sit with the tension. You grow stronger. Step 2. Ask yourself, will this serve me? Every scroll, every video, every like is a vote for laziness. Ask yourself, does this help me grow? Or is it stealing my life? Stoics call this the discipline of choice. You decide. Not your dopamine, not your feed. You. Step 3. Delay gratification. The Stoics trained themselves to value what lasts over what feels good now. Don't scroll. Pick one thing that actually moves you forward. Read, write, create, think, plan, train, learn. Every time you resist, you strengthen your mind. Every time you wait, you reclaim your power. Step 4. Reframe boredom as power. Silence. Nothing happening. That's where Stoics find strength. You can too. Learn to sit with yourself without a screen. Watch your mind. Watch your impulses. Let them come. Let them scream. And still, don't obey. Every moment you resist is a step toward real control. Step 5. Reinforce daily. Journal. Track your scrolling. Reflect on what you achieved instead. Write down every second you didn't waste. Stoicism isn't magic, it's muscle. And you're building it. One day, 1 second, 1 decision at a time. Step 6. Visualize the future you want. Every time you resist the scroll, picture your life differently. More energy. More focus. More freedom. More results. Let that image shame you into action. Let it guide every thumb movement. Let it remind you why you fight. Imagine the person you could be, the version you deserve. That life isn't waiting for you. It's being stolen every second you obey your impulses. Step 7. Own your environment. Remove triggers. Turn off notifications. Delete apps you don't need. Stoics understood external control matters. Your surroundings shape your mind. You can't fight laziness with distractions in your hand. Change your battlefield. Win the war before it even begins. Your phone isn't the enemy. You are. Every like you chase, every video you binge, it's a chain. Chains around your mind. Chains you can break. Chains you must break. The scroll is a battlefield. And until you fight, you lose. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Now. Every time you pick up that phone, you choose weakness or power. Stop lying to yourself. Stop scrolling. Apply these Stoic steps. Notice cravings. Question them. Delay gratification. Reframe boredom. Track your progress. Visualize the stronger version of you. Own your environment. Take control. Start living. Your life isn't waiting. It's happening now. Every scroll you resist is a vote for the person you're meant to become. Every moment you obey is a moment wasted. Stop obeying. Start winning. Start living like someone who refuses to be weak.